Thank you for taking the time this afternoon to join me as we discuss IPv4 to IPv6 address management strategies for success. My name is Tim Rooney. I am Director of Product Management for BT Diamond IP. And what we're going to talk about today is basically the first question perhaps you should ask is, why should I care about IPv6? How does it affect me? I've got plenty of IPv4 space. Shouldn't bother me, right? Well, we're going to talk about that. Then we'll talk about some of the key implementation challenges, particularly with respect to an address management perspective. Along with that, we'll talk about coexistence technology. So most of us here probably have IPv4 networks and don't have the luxury of starting with a greenfield v6 network. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Then we'll talk about management of the address space with respect to IP address management as it's traditionally defined. And then we'll talk about a couple of case studies, some real-world examples of people going through some of these challenges and what they've done to help address those challenges and implement IPv6 address management. Then we'll wrap it up with some conclusions. First, though, getting back to the why should I care question, if you go to ipv4.potoroo.net, they publish a daily report of the IPv4 address allocation status. And the primary motivation isn't so much to determine when IPv4 address space will deplete or run out. It's really targeted more for the regional internet registries to decide when do I need to change the way I do business, so to speak, with the community that needs address space. So in general, the hierarchy of how addresses get assigned is it all starts with the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, IANA. And they're a global organization. They basically are responsible for allocating address space. And they allocate space to what's called regional internet registries. So there are basically 5 of those, and they're globally based with respect to ARIN, American Registry for Internet Numbers, serving North America. There's RIPE in Europe, APNIC in Asia Pacific, AFRINIC, and LACNIC as well. So these regional internet registries, and they basically are the ones who allocate to ISPs. In some case, they allocate to end users, legacy type of owners going back before the ISP layer was inserted into the address management process. But if we look at this chart, we see that the red line kind of sloping down and to the right is indicating that the IANA pool, what IANA has available with IPv4 address space to allocate to these regional internet registries is diminishing quite rapidly. And the current projection, as of today's report, this is actually a printout of figure 30D of today's report or last night's run, indicates that in April of 2011, IANA will be out of address space. Now, IANA gives the address space or allocates it to the regional internet registry, so they still have some space, as you can see by the green line shown as a kind of a sawtooth level around 20/8 from an aggregate RIR perspective. But ultimately, they're not going to be able to go back to the well either when IANA runs out of space, and they too will run out of IPv4 address space. And basically, the RIRs are giving it to ISPs who give it to enterprises, so you can see in essence, the trickle-down effect of that. So v4 address space is diminishing. The facts show that, in fact, that is the case. So what are the implications of this IPv4 address space exhaustion? Well, certainly, obviously, there's not going to be any more v4 space to allocate. And in fact, the regional internet registries are actually in the process. Many of them are looking at currently redefining their roles with respect to v4 space from being one of allocating address space to perhaps even brokering transfers of address space among different holders of IPv4 space. So those organizations, however, that don't go through that transfer process and need address allocations will only be able to get IPv6 address space. For those that use IPv4 space internally, perhaps you're using private space, RFC 1918, for example, certainly that can continue to be used going forward. There's no change seen in that policy. However, based on capacity needs, it may drive the need, either through organic growth or perhaps mergers and acquisitions, the need to manage multiple IPv4 private address spaces. But really the third item here is the key why should I care item, beyond perhaps the fact that some of us are under a mandate within 3 months to turn on IPv6. Really the fact is that once we get to the point where only v6 is available for allocation, there's going to be enterprises, organizations out there that only are really able to publicly use IPv6 address space. So for those users to perhaps reach your websites, your email servers, your internet-facing applications, you're going to need to support an IPv6 presence to enable them to link up that communications. So that's really the fact here in terms of keeping that communication link open for the various IPv6 only enterprises out there that will need to communicate you for web, email, and so forth. And then likewise with DNS, having to make sure that the impact on the organization to make sure DNS accurately reflects reachability for resolution. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then for partner links, that's a little bit more under the control on a pairwise basis, for example, where perhaps translation or other technologies could be used. But that too is a possible impact on the IP address planning. The last item really relating to organizational impacts with respect to, beyond the technology piece, okay, v6 is coming, I need to do some level of v6 support on my network, perhaps it's just externally. But the fact that you are going to endeavor to do that now has implications on the organization with respect to now understanding that technology. I need to have my IT staff understand v6. They need to be able to configure the appropriate equipment, the servers, the routers, for example, to be able to route and serve up IPv6 addressability. And that lends itself to requiring training for users, obviously, and just ongoing IPv6 competence within the organization. So to summarize some of the key challenges with respect to implementation of IPv6, particularly with respect to address management, the first one's more generic, application stack, routers, really infrastructure level and application level device support of IPv6. And this is becoming less and less of an issue as more and more products and operating systems and applications natively support v6. You're seeing that more and more. So this is becoming less of an issue for organizations. But relating to IPv6 deployment, again, based on the assumption that you're starting with a current v4 network and you'd like to enable v6 reachability within that IPv4 network, it's typically a good idea to, if you're going from point A to point B, it's good to know where point A is, where you're starting from in order to map out an effective plan. And a lot of times that just requires a baselining of your v4 network. So perhaps if spreadsheets aren't quite up to date or whatever tool you're using to track IPv4, maybe it's time to take stock of that and make sure the v4 plan is up to date before beginning the plan for v6. And then we're going to talk a little bit in more detail about address allocation, but v6 offers a variety of allocation techniques beyond kind of the traditional best fit approach that was used within v4. But being able to maximize space to meet the requirement for hierarchical address allocation is key that needs to be considered as well. The transition approaches, so again, depending on the plan for allocation, perhaps there's certain offices you want to roll v6 into to begin with, just maybe in the lab, and then maybe in a couple of controlled production sites. So within those sites, from an address planning perspective, mapping your v4 and v6 space, perhaps any transition technologies that you're using that affect address space, such as tunneling technologies, some of the automatic tunneling, such as 6/4, EasyTap, and so forth, need to be considered from an address planning perspective as well. And then, of course, as v6 is then kind of gets through that initial phase within your network, rolling out further in terms of just managing that process of managing the IPv6 allocations with respect to IPv4, and again, just making sure that that is tracked in an inventory system is also recommended with respect to making sure that as IPv4 needs change and IPv6 needs grow, that can be managed in a cohesive fashion. And then lastly, again, getting back to the organizational impacts, really what the IT organization really needs to focus on is from a support perspective. So once it gets beyond IT and gets rolled out into affecting end users, now becomes the time where troubleshooting tools need to be put in place, being able to identify perhaps an IPv6 address associated with a v4 node. If somebody calls the help desk and says, well, I can't connect, well, what's your IP address? And if you want to hear an audible jaw drop over the phone for somebody to read back their v6 address, that would probably be the case. So having a tool to model that, to be able to track those addresses from a system, an inventory system, is a good way to avert that.